So thank you also for that kind introduction. For those of you that are in government at any level, I'll also note that I was in the government in the US for about 15 years, mostly at the Office of Management and Budget. And I ended that tenure as their head of technology policy and budget. So it was the role that's now carried by the US Federal Chief Information Officer. That was a terrific experience to enable me to then do the kind of work that Angie describes. And it's really been great to work with you all. I'll talk a little bit about the center that I run at IBM and then go through the presentation. And hopefully we'll have a few minutes for questions at the end of the session. So I'm really talking today about an initiative that's designed to help government leaders prepare for and respond to and grow resilience given increasing levels of shock from a number of different directions, whether that's cybersecurity, climate change, et cetera. Before I get into sort of the presentation, let me just tell you a little bit about the center for those of you that may not know about who we are. We are an independent think tank inside IBM. Our mission is to provide government leaders and stakeholders with research that will help them to do their jobs better, more effectively, more efficiently, use technology, develop procurement strategies, use data, manage workforces. Pretty much any issue that would hit a government leader in terms of an implementation challenge is within the scope of our research. And we actually have a research agenda that you can find on our website, businessofgovernment.org, as you see here, that enables us to identify the top issues that government leaders have told us they need to know more about. And that's the information we take to form the agenda. And then we actually go out to mostly academic experts who are the authors of our reports, the authors of the research. And as you see here, we have issued several hundred reports over the course of our tenure over the last 28 years now almost. And those reports range from a lot of topics around technology to, as I said, other elements of government management. We also have a weekly, we had a radio show for years. Now we have a podcast and a radio show where we talk to government leaders about their challenges, opportunities. It's probable that we have talked to a leader that you've worked with in the past, because these are people from all levels of government and around the world. We do a lot of speaking and writing, sort of on a more short-term basis through blogs and social media and that sort of type of engagement through our website. And then we engage in a lot of convenings, and I'll talk about a number of them as I talk through the Future Ready Government discussion here. And those can be in person in DC or virtual, or oftentimes now we do a lot of hybrid engagement. So really looking forward to the discussion. And if anybody wants to know more about the center, feel free to reach out to me. In addition to the topic we'll talk about today, I'll leave my contact information. It'll be on the last slide. Thanks, Angie. Next slide. Yes. All right. So the concept of future ready government is in a world that you don't have to be reading the papers more than once a month to know that there are increasing ways that the environment, through technology, through migration change patterns, et cetera, are leading to different ways that nation states, societies, and local communities, and everybody in between are sort of feeling the effects of these different types of events, whether they're a hurricane or a tornado or a flood, or perhaps a supply chain incident that if you know, in the US, we've had last year we had a major supply chain disruption in the Port of Baltimore when a bridge was collapsed because a ship ran into it, and that led to global supply chain shocks around the world. So these kinds of shocks, just given the interconnectedness of the way that countries work together and the way that supply chains are developed to provide much more than sort of what you might think of as the traditional supply chain relationship in terms of products. So a lot of technology is developed in a global supply chain effort, as well as different products. And now even services are put together with people from different countries working together. And so this sort of global effect of these shocks is happening at an increasing rate and an increasing level of intensity. And so we kept hearing from, excuse me, We kept hearing from government leaders that they needed to get better at resiliency and get better at sort of being ready for what might come next, and how they can work together and with industry to prepare for that. So if you go to the next slide, Angie, we sort of came up with a moniker of future shocks, with apologies to those of you that might have read Alvin Toffler's famous book, Future Shock, which really defines why do we need government that's ready for the future in the next coming decades throughout the 21st century. And we sort of broke down those shocks that I mentioned in the previous page into a set of categories. One where you think about what's the scope of impact in terms of, is this happening at a local community or a region, or is this more of a global impact, or sort of different area of the world, different areas of the world like Europe or the Americas, et cetera, Asia. And then are these shocks sort of sudden, like a natural disaster, or are they slow onset but still with significant impact? Think of climate events, aging populations, et cetera. And all of these different areas affect many different sectors of the economy, many different levels of government, and the people who government serves in different ways. But there are a number of modalities and characteristics that governments can learn from one another and across domains, as we'll hear about momentarily. For example, when you solve a cybersecurity event, there might be lessons learned that the climate change community could benefit from in terms of collaboration, interconnectedness with the private sector, et cetera. So we kind of set up this initial framework to kind of give a taxonomy to what are the types of shocks that we are seeing, and where are governments interacting with them, so that we can see how best to respond, and how to help governments develop capabilities to work with civil society, the private sector, to address these kinds of events. All right, next slide. So we put together an initiative that's now actually in its 4th year. It might be 5 if I count the calendar right. It's around now that the anniversary of the initiation of this initiative will occur. And it really came out of the pandemic, which, as we lived through, was sort of the major once in a century global shock that we all kind of worked through and are still feeling the effects of in a number of different ways. But that we know that there are these other kinds of major events, disasters, crises that will face governments, and that there is a role for a set of convenings and capabilities to be developed to help governments understand, all right, how can I use technology to get ahead of the threat? How can I develop governance processes to work across communities, across sectors, to be able to respond more effectively? And again, the questions are, how can we do this at any level of government, whether it's a city, a state, or a national government? And then also, how can we help governments develop capabilities to respond, and also themselves and with ecosystem partners? And so the goal of this initiative was to gather leaders in Washington and around the world to essentially identify what some of these capabilities are, and how to build resilience in addressing them. And so that's sort of the framework. I wanted to give you the 100,000-foot context, and now we're going to go into the specifics going forward. And I see people are already starting to populate the chat, which is fantastic. So we'll look forward to a robust discussion. Next slide, Angie. All right, so how did we actually do this? We went, and if you remember, there were a bunch of logos on the first slide, which I didn't talk through, but I'll mention them here. We worked with the National Academy of Public Administration, which, for those of you that don't know, is a congressionally chartered national academy, operates much like the National Academy of Sciences. And there are about 1,000 fellows of the academy who are often former government leaders like myself, or former academic, or current and former academic experts. There are some current government folks here at all levels of government. NAPA has an intergovernmental standing panel, which does a lot of work with state and local governments. So those of you that are leaders or officials in state governments or working with the states, which I know many of you are, might find their content very interesting as well. We work with a number of other organizations, including the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, AmCham, which is the American Chamber of Commerce in Europe, the Center for American Studies, And then we've been working with other partners bilaterally in Latin America, Australia, and Asia, as we'll come to at the end. And the way we went about this work was to bring together leaders in these kinds of roundtables where anywhere between 10 and 40 or 50 government, industry, academic, civil society leaders would talk through a particular issue. What's the challenge? How do we respond? And then how do we create lessons that government leaders can adapt as they're moving forward? And we wanted to go to different places where the shocks were being felt in different ways. So we did one at the bottom of this column you see in the Port of Rotterdam. We did one meeting in Helsinki to talk about the effects of climate change in Northern Europe. And then we put together a set of studies, and I'll talk more about those in a minute, where we kind of distilled the content. And all of these studies, by the way, are free and available to you. All of our content is free and in the public domain, and I'll give the URL to get to all those studies in a few slides. But this gives you a sense of, this really was a global initiative. We worked with the National Association of State Chief Information Officers as well, and some other state and local groups. So really did try to think about this as a multi-level government challenge and need to respond. Next slide. All right, so now let's get into the content. The way we sort of looked at the world here was in these convenings, and you see a couple of photos from some of the convenings to the left, was to think about what are different domains, not all, but what are some key domains that face government in terms of how to address these kinds of shocks as they occur. Let's see, it says I'm supposed to confirm that I'm in the English language, so I'm going to do that. The domains are ranged from the discipline of emergency preparedness to sort of what can we learn from in the US emergency management as a profession, and how does that profession teach resilience and response capabilities that people in other types of sectors like cybersecurity experts or workforce managers, et cetera, can learn from. We then sort of looked at cybersecurity as an issue and potential cyber incidents, how to respond there, supply chain risk management, and how to modernize government's response there. Actually, we're hosting another meeting on supply chain risk management tomorrow at our center. We looked at climate resilience and the challenges of being weather ready as we go forward. NAPA, actually, our partner, the National Academy of Public Administration, now has a weather ready center that grew in part out of this initiative in terms of the interest for that. We looked at the issue of, this is one of the slow onset shocks that I mentioned, as governments face aging workforces or different governments have different priorities and they need to rebalance their talent. How do you address that, and how do you sort of build a skilled government workforce that can do the work to address these shocks effectively? And then finally, through all of our work, we had a theme around, as I said, intergovernmental cross-border collaboration that we did this. So for each of these 6 domains, if you go to the next slide, Angie, we actually had a roundtable, usually in the US and one overseas. And then we did a summary post and then a full-scale report, as well as a background paper. And each of those papers has in it the kinds of capabilities that let's say you're working as a cyber expert with your state, or you are in a procurement office and you care about supply chain in a city, or you are working in the Department of Natural Resources. You'll see that there is content for cybersecurity, supply chain, sustainability that you can really reach into and identify what are the key details around how to build these capabilities. I'll talk some generally about sort of cross-domain capabilities momentarily, but if we really had time and we had 6 hours or so, we could really drill down into each of these topics and talk about different capabilities. Importantly, one of the lessons that we learned was that these types of conversations are very important for government leaders to learn over time how to sort of move from from the lessons learned from responding to one crisis and get better at building resiliency to prepare for the next. Often we heard government leaders say, well, after the crisis is over, the incentives are to go back to our day jobs. And the learning that we did to come together to build the governance structures, the data exchange protocols, the contracts working with industry to respond to the particular shock, those kind of went away. And we had to reinvent them the next time around. And so one of the key lessons that we took forward, one of the key themes, I should say, that we took through all of this work was that as government moves through these kinds of response categories to become more ready for the future, that readiness depends on building governance structures so that you don't lose the capability as a government in terms of, let's say, how did we put in place that rapid contract with particular private sector companies that have the expertise that we need? How do we make sure that we can quickly ramp up to that? Or if we pulled in cyber reservists, let's say there was a cyber incident and some states have reserve corps of cybersecurity experts. How do we make sure that we can expand that capability and learn over time how to do that more easily? The other thing we learned that was interesting, and this is sort of a novel element of the future shocks work in terms of helping government to become future ready, is that across these 6 domains, there aren't a lot of opportunities for cross-domain collaboration and learning. So we learned from the cybersecurity experts that they really wanted to know when the supply chain community gets together and thinks about how do they think about setting up a resilient supply chain category and set of relationships and business modalities. How do they learn in the cybersecurity world from what the supply chain people have done so they can develop better products, services, and capabilities in cybersecurity? And the converse is also true. The supply chain community was very interested in what the cyber world was doing. We learned that sustainability community really was interested in emergency preparedness and how do they develop a capability that's similar to crisis response for longer term development of weather and climate resiliency. And so these conversations that we had, we tried to think about, all right, not just within a domain, but across domains, what are the key capabilities? And we developed a paper as part of the Future Shock series that identifies what some of those are. So if you go to the next slide, Angie, I'm going to go over 7 that sort of cut across all of the different domains in different areas. And some of this won't be rocket science to all of you, but it sort of reinforces here are areas that governments can work in advance and can bring in partners in civil society, academia, and industry to develop ways of working in these different areas that can help address any shock in any domain, learning from lessons learned from across the 6 that I mentioned, as well as the pandemic that I mentioned, which sort of set the foundation for this work. So the first area is around foresight and proactivity, if that's a word, to basically think about, all right, how do you do scenario planning? How do you do predictive analytics using new data analytics tools and artificial intelligence to do different types of scenario settings, to do exercises, not just in emergency management, where we know they do a lot of exercises for preparedness, but in other areas and other domains that government's involved in that crises may occur. How do you think about using foresight and thinking ahead and using analytics to get ahead of the threat? So a lot of the new tools can enable you to look as a government or as a partner of government to look across many different similar incidents around the world and see what are the patterns that led to, let's say, a particular kind of supply chain incident. What were the common patterns before that existed a week, a month, a year before those incidents? And can you build a model to help the government predict more effectively when those anomalies occur, so that the government can then respond and develop ways to mitigate in advance the problems that might occur from those anomalies and prevent the crisis from happening in the first place. So that's one set of capabilities. The second similar one is to do that using artificial intelligence and other platforms, not just to think about them as a sort of an analytical tool, but also as a tool that you can turn from analysis to action in terms of having the the data in place so that if an event occurs, that you can move from planning to reaction and response in real time, and enable timely action that's based on some of the analysis that's occurred before, and using the precision of the prior experience in terms of how to shape the steps that governments can take. So the first step is set up the analytics to think ahead. And the second is set them up in such a way that you can then pivot to a response. In order to do that pivoting, you need the third capability, which is a technology platform and a set of technology capabilities that will allow you to act quickly, to work across different types of computing environments, to do so in a way that builds cybersecurity in upfront, because the last thing you need is to have in the middle of a crisis, have a cyber event that's interrupting the systems that you're using to manage the crisis. So think about building in this concept of zero trust cybersecurity into the technology that's being used. And then using that technology in a way that enables flexibility, response, scaling up. Cloud computing is a platform that allows, as those of you that know about cloud, now it operates, you can scale up quickly and scale back down based on the need and the demand that's available. So thinking about not just, let's do this on our old set of sort of technology assets that we have in our environment, but how do we think ahead about bringing in best practice from industry to use technology in an agile fashion that can enable these kinds of responses? So those are kind of three interrelated capabilities that we took in terms of data and technology. The next set of capabilities really is more around governance and collaboration. And the first one is really something that we see a lot in natural disasters, not as much in some of these other domain areas. And that is, let's think about sort of what are the needs of the locality? How can you develop collaborative relationships so that the first time you're exchanging business cards is not in the middle of a crisis, that you sort of work in advance to develop relationships and think about who would we need to work with at the government level, which agencies, which programs at which agencies, how can we use organizations like the National Governance Association or the ICMA, the City County Management Association, as sort of points of inflection, so that governments at different levels can work together, can reach many different, like the federal government can reach many different local partners at once, that the local governments have a organizational structure within Washington. So you don't have to invent these types of cross-boundary collaborative governance processes. You can use existing processes to coordinate across different levels of government, and that doing so in a manner where these types of crises tend not to know boundaries, except for like a very localized, let's say, flood in a river plain in a state or something like that, that you really need to have these types of relationships and build them early. Build them so that you know your roles and responsibilities in advance. That's something we learned, especially actually one of the things we learned in Northern Europe is that they have a very good governance capability that they used also to work with the private sector. So it's not just an intergovernmental, but it gets to the next modality that I'll talk about, which is the cross-sector partnerships, which is, it's often the case that government is working with contractors. That's the more traditional relationship for governments to work with the private sector around developing these kinds of capabilities. But also think about, are there different types of alliances? Are there basically capabilities where government, civil society, and the private sector can work together in the kinds of convenings that we were doing to develop this content? So we've tried to model in developing the Future Ready initiative through the Future Shocks work. We tried to model the cross-sector behavior that we heard from governments is needed in terms of developing capabilities. So again, an example would be putting in place a set of contracts so that companies can be quickly enlisted, sort of like a reserve capability in the event of a crisis in different kinds of domain areas. And how do you develop those contract vehicles in advance so that those companies can come in quickly and you don't need to wait for the procurement cycle to get done to create that, or you don't have to do lots of workarounds in a crisis fashion. Sometimes governments will do emergency procurements, and if in that setting, you actually have a lot of processes that maybe don't get tied off properly because you're working so fast. So thinking about it in advance to do this in a procurement setting, that's the next capability, embedding resilience into procurement. I actually spoke about this topic at the OECD a month ago. They had a global forum on public procurement, and it was all about how do we build in our panel, how do we build a resilience capability such that government can incentivize industry to develop the types of technologies and capabilities and develop standards so that the government can use those relationships more effectively, and companies are incentivized to act with resilience. Having been both in government and in the private sector, I can say from both sides that both sides of what I did, I could have done a better job of thinking about sort of building in incentives into those types of processes, and saying so that companies who will do the thing that government asks, if it's written into the procurement properly. Many procurements are written in more of a bureaucratic way, or they rely too much on processes, or there's too much attention to terms and conditions. Think about things like outcome-based procurement that defines the outcome that is being sought, and then how does a company then achieve that outcome, and then have companies kind of compete to say, all right, who's got the best solution to address that outcome, becomes much more of a merits-based discussion rather than traditional procurements, which are often very, very process-oriented. We're doing a separate set of research at the IBM Center on outcomes-based procurement with a group called the National Contract Management Agency. If any of you are in the procurement world, you may know of this organization. It's sort of the nationwide procurement professional organization. So more to come on that. And then finally, across all of these activities, none of this gets done without a skilled workforce that understands, all right, how do we bring in, you don't have to be an AI expert, but you need to know about how to bring in AI and cloud computing, and who to turn to, who are the experts, to solve not just a business need, but to develop these kinds of resilience strategies to become better ready for what might come in the future. Agile practices here are very important. I mentioned that before in a couple of different ways, but thinking about enabling government employees to not have to be constrained in bureaucracy, but develop processes and incentives that reward risk-taking, reward the ability to move quickly, reward the ability to develop foresight, and pivot quickly in developing the kinds of capabilities that I talked about earlier. And then, of course, leadership, very important in the middle of a crisis. One of our most remarkable leaders in crisis management at the federal level, Thad Allen, who has overseen the response to a number of different natural disasters, has written a lot about this topic of crisis leadership and developing training techniques and executive coaching capabilities to enable leaders to help provide the right type of environment so that government workforces can become more future ready. So these were 7 kind of key modalities that we saw in our research. And I'll go to the next slide. We're getting toward the end and toward the discussion, so I'll look forward to that. One of the things we did also, in addition to those meetings that I mentioned around the world, was we worked with the IBM Institute for Business Value, which is a research organization, sort of a partner of ours inside IBM, to do some research with government leaders around the world. And to say, all right, in addition to the discussions that we're having and the collaborative engagement that we get through those discussions and the reports that we issued that I talked about a couple of slides ago, are there areas where government leaders can kind of respond in more of a survey way to give us thoughts about how to develop these types of capabilities and become better able to respond to and be resilient in the face of these kinds of shocks? And some of them are sort of parallel to the set that I talked about in the previous slide. But interestingly, one of the ones that didn't really come across in the workshops, but came across in the survey, was make sure that you don't let your workforce get complacent. You know, just because the weather's nice for 2 weeks doesn't mean that you need to be, you don't need the umbrellas and the ability to, in the winter, to get the snowplows out quickly. So just think about, it's always, especially at a time of calm, and this sort of gets to the point about being prepared for a crisis and using times of calm to develop better response capabilities. We talked before in the last slide around analytics and artificial intelligence, and I'm sure many of you now are using generative AI in your work. And so that was identified by some leaders as a way to develop technologies that can enable people to go more deeply into some of the content that is that sort of underlies developing some of these capabilities, and then develop using generative AI to perhaps develop strategic plans, draft strategic plans that would then be discussed by teams to think about how do we move forward in this area. We talked before about cybersecurity. That came through in the research as well. We talked about agility and innovation. We didn't really talk as much about sort of the concept of this takes both people as individuals, and it also takes teams. And we talked on the last slide about the workforce. Almost never does a crisis or the need to sort of build readiness get done by a single person. Individual people are incentivized, and their performance plans can be managed properly by government leaders. Just as important, and not as well done by government, and frankly not as well done by industry in a lot of ways, how are teams incentivized to work together to achieve these kinds of outcomes and to build these kinds of capabilities, and thinking about developing incentive structures, team-based awards, team-based performance evaluations. It was something that came across in the research as a capability that obviously will benefit government in providing everyday services to the people that live in a city or a state or a country, but also in developing capabilities that can be harnessed quickly in the event of a crisis. We talked about public-private partnerships. The last point I'll make, we didn't really talk about in the last slide, but it's critically important. Anytime you're responding to any sort of a crisis or a shock, a trusted relationship with the people that you're serving as a government is critical. It's often built by different ways of building trust over time, and can be an effective response in the face of a crisis can build trust that the government can do so in the next crisis. An effective communication plan is really important here. One of the things the research showed is that it's better to try to kind of identify in advance, here are the benefits that are accruing to you of all these programs. Here are some things that are risks that governments are facing, or governments are facing in terms of their service delivery to citizens. And here's the way those risks can manifest, so that if the crisis occurs, it's not a shock in and of itself just to hear about that it occurred because you never thought about it before. So sort of thinking about risk communication and identifying risks in advance and developing government capabilities to do that is both a capability that governments can develop to address shocks and become more future ready, and it's also a way to build trust as well. And a lot of these types of lessons were identified in this particular paper, which is part of the Future Shock series around building future-ready governments. All right, Angie, next slide. All right, so I mentioned this is a multi-year initiative. I'm not going to read through every check mark, but I'll just put that we did most of the research around the roundtables we did in the first year. Actually, there was a year before this, 22, where we did a lot of preparation. In the second year, we did a lot of sort of case studies, and we looked at what are ways that governments are working effectively to develop and implement the kinds of things that are being recommended by the Future Shocks initiative in order to become future ready. And we've actually started to catalog a set of cases where governments are really performing admirably and where they have lessons that can be learned by other governments. We've developed, I think, 2 sets of case studies now. The way we develop these case studies is through a challenge grant methodology, where we actually ask people all over the country and around the world, give us examples of where governments are really doing a good job developing future-ready strategies and using technology and AI and developing the kinds of governance processes that we talked about. And then we've collected those in these compendiums that we're releasing. So one of the things that I'll make as a request of the audience is, if you have examples of where your government has done a really interesting job, a novel job, something that's worth sharing with other governments, send me an email, and we'd love to know more about that. And because, as you see in the current year, we're continuing the program. we're continuing through our survey research, and we're now developing other types of sort of interactive capabilities to help governments learn more around simulations, design thinking sessions, et cetera. So this is an initiative that I've described that's been ongoing. And as the arrow shows, it will continue to go into the future. And next year, I'll have the 2026 column to brief in a future setting. Okay, and I think we have one or two more slides. Okay, so I mentioned that this is really a global initiative. And one of the things we've learned is that through this initiative, we've developed a lot of connectivity across different leaders and different organizations around the world. And we've developed different types of interests in one part of the world that can be learned and adapted in other parts of the world. So a lot of the work that I mentioned before happened in these workshops in North America. And I should mention that a lot of the work that we looked at around technology, I mentioned artificial intelligence. There are other types of technologies in addition to AI and cloud. You know, the advent of quantum computing isn't that far away. And sort of how can governments help to leverage the benefits of that to develop these types of predictive strategies, predictive capabilities, but also quantum provides an opportunity for adversaries to present significant cybersecurity risks. And so one of the things we learned in sort of under that North America pilot was we need to think about developing technologies that can help governments in all settings, not just in the middle of a crisis, but overall, be able to respond to cyber threats where the adversaries are taking advantage of quantum capabilities to do things like break encryption. So encryption is sort of a core to a lot of cybersecurity in how technology systems operate, and those encryption algorithms are more vulnerable to a quantum computing model. So this concept of post-quantum cryptography, which some of you may have heard about, is starting to be talked about as a capability that governments need to think about how to get ready for the next set of shocks in going forward. In Europe, one of the things we learned, and this is certainly true, I think, in a sort of across, if you think about the US states as a sort of a collective of governed bodies, these types of understanding sort of what's the sovereignty, what's within borders in terms of responsibility of government and what can be shared across borders. You know, our data privacy laws in Europe, you know, they have a data privacy directive that moves across borders across the European Union. And then how do we think about that with respect to individual countries, and how might you adapt that to a cross-border capability situation in the US? Do you need a national privacy law? Could you create a multi-state compact? That sort of thing. If you look at the right-hand column, we looked across across Europe and in NATO, and applying this to a lot of the areas of defense capability, and thinking about that's a whole nother area of shock that isn't really one that we addressed in this initiative, the defense and intelligence world. But there are capabilities there that NATO's developed that most civilian agencies don't necessarily think about as what can I learn from defense and intelligence around capabilities and responses, but there are ways, and we learned that in some of our discussions in the EU and Brussels. I mentioned the Helsinki meeting. We had a meeting in Rome where we got together defense ministers and civilian agency ministers from around Europe to think about how do you apply things like cybersecurity and move those capabilities that are developed in the defense space into civilian agency spaces so that you can develop a better risk management profile. And then sort of underlying all of this is the fact that in any sort of intergovernmental collaboration around future readiness, whether it's across cities, across states, across cities and states with the federal government or internationally, that ensuring that the discussions are relevant to the different levels of government. If something is applicable to one government but doesn't really translate, you're going to have a shorter conversation in an international dialogue. That they're referenceable, meaning you can understand them. If you're one level of government, you can understand what those reference points are so you can adapt it. And then that adaptation involves replicability to be able to adapt and respond in in that different country setting. So this is a way of illustrating how some of the learnings that we did in individual countries or even individual states in the US you can develop these types of collaborative mechanisms. And we worked with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, to develop some of the practical implications of that collaboration. And those collaborative processes, I think, are relevant to intergovernmental collaboration at any level. All right, I think we're just about done. Yes, all right, Angie, thank you. Thank you for your guidance. Thank you for driving. As I became the backseat driver, as I was, the passenger guiding the tour. So I just wanted to close with, again, here's my contact information. You can find me on LinkedIn. I mentioned our website. Again, all of our content is free and in the public domain. And I would welcome a discussion, looking at the chat and seeing sort of what else you might have to talk about. And I think we've got about 15 minutes or so, Angie, maybe 14 minutes, right?